very brief background for me. I've been working on FAIR since probably, I think it's late 2016 now, for several years at Bank of America, building a very large program. Right now I'm at Datto, sort of an IT backup and resilience company that sells through MSP channels to build a risk quantification program for them that's based on FAIR, shifting from, how do we change a large organization to how do we enable the nimbleness of a smaller organization? So very different perspectives. And these are what I want to talk about today, and they're in no particular order, to some extent for a reason. Some of the rabbit holes that I've gone down over the past few years, and many of them are particularly on my mind right now. As we go through this, if there's something that's up here that you want me to dive into in particular, by all means, throw it into chat, throw the question into chat. This is an open conversation. Somebody will let me know, and we can talk through it. So first of all, one of the first observations is that, when we're going, all journeys have destinations is where I think I'll start. One of the reasons this isn't very organized is FAIR is a great tool, but and honestly, a lot of the value that we see is getting people together, building a common consensus on what your problems are, what your risk factors are, what your drivers are. So there's a lot of value in FAIR, but it's also there's a lot of concepts underneath it. And it's very hard to, in my experience, teach all of those concepts to a large group of people, or even a medium-sized group of people. They need something tangible. So when you're building a FAIR program, or you're dealing with a new set of stakeholders, one of the first things that we have to go down is start talking about what is the specific problem we're trying to solve here. A lot of times, we've run into, what is FAIR? What is FAIR? And it's like describing a hammer to somebody and not being able to explain whether or not you're building a house, or what are you doing with the tool in particular. It's something that can do a lot of things. So having a destination in mind, having a particular problem, and not just a problem, but how it looks. What is the actual output of this conversation going to look like? What is the document, the tool, the numbers? How does it actually look visually? How is somebody going to process the output of this? Is something that's really helpful to scope down how you want to build a FAIR program and how you want to run FAIR. Along those lines, one of my other sort of recent rabbit holes is we talk about FAIR being about normalizing language a lot. And I don't necessarily agree with that so much as when we have language disagreements, we have a different problem in many cases, which is we're using the wrong models. Everyone has a model of the world in their head. They've got a theory of change, a theory of how risk works, a theory of how information security works. And so, when we're using the same words, those words are proxies for this mental image we have. And so when you're working through FAIR and you're, what is resistance strength? Well, you ask 10 people, they're going to have 12 different answers to what resistance strength is. When you ask them what risk appetite is, they might have the formal definition, right? But that formal definition probably maps to a different model. So when you're building FAIR and you want things to be transparent, you want them to, work together, good analysis to work together over time, start modeling what's actually happening when we talk about resistance strength. Just philosophically, what is that? What is loss to the organization? Not if you can't describe what loss is, it's very hard to measure it. Just, I think yesterday I had a conversation with somebody in an area of finance, and we were talking through loss, and they're like, well, do you mean dollars out the door, or do you mean future revenue? Or, what is the pain point that you're talking about when you talk about loss? So if we want to normalize communication, which we just saw in that poll is super important, we have to normalize the models that go underneath and make them explicit. So, once we have good models, then switching over, we can talk about telling stories. One of the junior mistakes that I think a lot of folks make is we're going to do analyses. We're going to pop out an annualized loss exposure and some frequencies, and we're going to sort of slide it under the door, and magic will happen. I find that often to not be the case. FAIR and risk analyses and risk quantification give you an opportunity to tell a story. What do we think is happening? How does the organization relate to this? Whose role is what? What is this control actually doing? So, people operate not with numbers, they operate with stories. And those numbers should support the stories. The risk factors that you use and the analysis work you do should, tell a narrative. That's one of the key things to get something accepted. Um, let's switch over a little bit. Scenarios are hypotheses. We talk about I talked about the models earlier. A scenario is almost like a SQL select statement that you can use. What is your belief about the world? What data do we need to answer that question? It's less about, in my mind, hey, do we have the right sequence of events? Do we have the right kill chain? Do we have the right attack chain? And more about, what do I think is happening here? And let's build a scenario that describes that. And this gets also into, like, don't let FAIR bully you. When I say that, one of the discussion I heard not long ago had a lot to do with, what is secondary loss event frequency, and they wanted to formalize it across the board, or, what is exactly threat event frequency. And what I see a lot is people try and map scenarios over, or risk analyses over, to FAIR, and they try and stick with, the definitions of the factors. Don't. FAIR is open, it's easy, it's flexible. One of the nice things about it is that it's really taking a series of Venn diagrams and sort of Monte Carloing them together so that you get uncertainty reduced. If FAIR says, hey, this box is for productivity loss, you could call it whatever you want. One of the things we're doing at Datto is creating our own forms of loss, particular to the organization. There's a particular subset of customers that if they're impacted, are going to respond entirely different than a different subset of customers. So for us, those are actually two different forms of loss. I don't really care necessarily the fact that there aren't, fields in RiskLens or fields in Excel spreadsheet that describe that. It just doesn't matter. So one of the things is that you want to do is model the business that you're in, model the problem that you have. And if FAIR doesn't quite match it, that's okay. You don't want to shove something into the model just because it doesn't quite fit. The model is flexible, the approach is flexible. So, I just can't emphasize that enough. In some cases, we'll use, for example, primary loss magnitude just as almost a placeholder. I've made it $1 before and worked entirely in secondary loss event frequency. This is because there's an event that could happen and it triggers a number of different other cascading events. And I'm really more interested in those cascading events from a cost standpoint. Maybe we had incident response completely budgeted and that just wasn't the question. So we ignored primary loss. There's no reason you can't. Formally in FAIR, they're going to say every time there's a loss event, there's a loss. I would say every time there's a loss event, there's a reaction. That reaction may or may not incur loss. And so there are absolutely situations where you can play with how those factors are used. Speaking of that, one of my ticks personally is that confidentiality and integrity and availability events are inherently loss events. If you really start diving down into what happens when you have an incident may not trigger any loss whatsoever. A near miss might actually end up triggering more loss than an actual incident. And so your loss events end up being those things that where your security apparatus, the security of your systems, creates a situation where expectations out of your organization, out of your systems, are not met. This could be customer expectations, this could be regulatory expectations, this could be documented in policy. So your loss events are in many cases business events. And so, instead of looking at it from a purely technical standpoint, you might not really be modeling what's happening. If you're going, hey, we have a confidentiality problem. If it's a confidentiality problem and nobody responds because they're used to confidentiality problems happening, then and they don't really expect confidentiality, then you don't have a loss event. An example of this that we talked about at the bank is Home Depot. Nobody expected Home Depot to protect their information. They're a hardware sales company, but they expected the banks to protect their information. And so some of the fallout for Home Depot did not show up at Home Depot. It showed up at the banks because that loss event of that loss of confidentiality, there wasn't an expectation there that something was going to happen. Similarly, again, at the bank, we talked about SWIFT breaches. And I'm firmly and SWIFT is international money transfer between financial institutions. And in many cases, the loss event is we expect SWIFT to have integrity and to do what it should. And if we think it doesn't, we're going to go respond. And whether or not there's an actual breach in that case, a lot of those response models look very similar and the costing looks very similar. And so the loss event there is the belief that there may have been a breach as opposed to any dollar transfer. It's all just ones and zeros at that point. So in many cases, if those dollars get transferred, they get transferred right back. Somebody goes, oh, they stole money and we're just going to put the dollars back in the bucket. So that's when you're working through your models, when you're working through your language, when you're working through your scenarios, you want this theory of the world that you have. And when we start talking about data, unless you have a good theory of the world, the data doesn't mean anything. It's just a fact. Facts don't have meaning. We create meaning. So when we're collecting data, just because it's there, what it says may be something entirely different. One of the things that we had a conversation about not long ago at Datto was the difference between data that represents exposure today and data that represents exposure tomorrow. Those are maybe not the same data points, and InfoSec is very good about collecting data about today. What are my vulnerabilities? How much data do we have in this particular asset? How's it configured? But how many vulnerabilities we have today may or may not indicate something about how likely we are to have vulnerability over time. It may be, but it may not. When you start looking, the further you start looking out, the more you're looking at data about variance controls and governance controls. If I'm looking 10 years out at my organization, and that might be too long for a lot of risk analyses, but for sake of conversation, as we go further out, it becomes more about how well do we govern things, because today might be an outlier, this week might be an outlier. So your indicators about the future and your data should be really about how are we operating over time? How well do we manage our performance? Because that might tell me more about the future than my current data today. So one of the challenges with FAIR is to shift that viewpoint from trying to go down the weeds about what is configured or what is not configured or what exists, and start looking at it from more of a business and an operational and a performance standpoint. I think that's important. But that said, you see a bullet here that says you don't need data, and this gets to, I think most of the time you need data, but what I'm trying to get at with that particular bit of information is that FAIR is a reasoning tool. We talked about communication between stakeholders. One of the things that you should be looking for is if you take data out of it, you're taking two different sets of beliefs or three different sets of beliefs, and you're trying to merge them together. And so even if you had opinions, and I'm not suggesting this is the best thing to do, you can document your opinions through FAIR. You can go, hey, here's what this looks like. Here's what this looks like. Does this reflect reality? And so data is something that supports your theory of change. It supports your theory of the world, or it doesn't. There's a lot that can be learned from looking at how randomized control trials are run, and looking at FAIR. You come up with the hypotheses, you go find information that supports that, and then the output is something that tells you where you are, where you aren't. This is important. So that said, when we talk about people and we talk about communication, there's a few things I want to say. First, it takes a village, and you should be at the center of the universe. One of my frustrations is often where FAIR is treated as something that's in addition to, or to the adjacent to what's happening in information security. If you've got something that's telling you how much risk you have, that should be the center of all of your decisions. It's not something that you answer decisions with. That should be the engine that populates that runs your organization, because it's in the middle of, if you are acting and you don't know how much risk there is, then what exactly are you doing? Are you actually managing risk? Are you doing the right thing? The answer is no. So from an output standpoint, there isn't a part of the organization that shouldn't have a cascading impact from FAIR. On the other side, what do we do about making FAIR run? This is a great conversation about metrics. No metric left behind is something that I say up there. If you have a metric that cannot inform a risk analysis, that cannot tell you anything about what the future of your risk looks like, what exactly is that metric telling you? If you see where I'm going, what is that information speaking to us? If it can't tell you how much risk you have, then why are you measuring it? It might not be risk that you're already measuring. You might need to create different analysis sets, different scenarios. But if you're measuring something to take action, then the reason you have to measure something is because there might be a negative consequence. And you have some uncertainty about that consequence if you don't measure it. That's what metrics are for. They help you make decisions to avoid bad things in the future. And then what FAIR does is it answers you how much and how bad will bad things be given current conditions. So there's a perspective here that says, in a perfect world, FAIR provides your risk visibility, your metrics. You take a meal prep approach, right? Everyone prepares the set of metrics that goes into a change control set of scenarios, and that tells you what your risk is in different conditions and different situations. It's given how InfoSec is built, that's a big ask and probably not one that most people will reach, but it's useful to think through in terms of what you want to try and accomplish. That meal prep piece, I think, is also important in that, a lot of times in FAIR programs are started, it feels like a consulting gig. We get a bunch of people in a room over and over and over again, and we answer questions, and that creates burnout over time. If you keep getting the same subject matter experts into the room and you're answering slightly different questions repeatedly, that there's a lot of burnout. The heavyweight initial work that you do needs to be split up a little bit. It needs to be change managed. There needs to be a development life cycle. One of the things we're working on right now is, at the start of the quarter, do we have any major visibility changes that we're interested in incorporating? Then, that turns into a set of data requirements. And then those data requirements get answered by the same people, the same way, in the same structure. And then by the end of the quarter, we've piped out, an update to a baseline analysis. And then people can do what ifs from that. And the idea here is you want to do as much of the work in a predictable way, on a predictable schedule, and get as much of the information you need in the same way as possible. This is implications for how you set up scenarios, going back to scenarios or hypotheses. If your scenarios are overlapping, or if they don't cover the breadth of the risk that your organization faces, or they're changing, then your data requirements and how you provide data change. You might not be able to answer some of the questions that you want to answer. So there's some thought, not just about, hey, is this a top risk scenario, but what is the actual coverage that I need? What would be comprehensive? And how do these scenarios relate to each other? If we can't be clear about how the scenarios relate to each other, then we start getting overlap between our threat event frequency assumptions and things like that. So think about the structure, again, going back to what's the theory of risk that you have for your organization. I think that's important. One other thing, pivoting a little bit, and honestly, if somebody wants to direct me elsewhere, I'm just going to keep going, but I just want to reaffirm that, or if you've got questions. One of the things that comes up a lot is, hey, this isn't, there's some subjectivity in here. Isn't it just guessing? And the answer is calibrated estimation is important. But one of the goals of FAIR is to reduce the amount of subjectivity needed, but you can't remove it. So one of the things I've been focusing on lately is thinking of who is going to be the guesser, which group of people. Not everybody has the right vision to be the calibrated estimation person. Not everybody sees the larger picture. You can improve calibrated estimation. You can make it better, but we're looking at building a small cadre of people who are going to be provided the data. They're going to be provided the opinions. They're going to be provided the expertise, and it's their job on a regular basis to interpret that data and come up with the actual FAIR factor estimates. And they're going to be calibrated. So we're trying to create some consistency here. And this is because not all subject matter experts are subject matter experts. You might have a firewall expert who can tell you how they're running the firewall, but they might not actually know what that firewall is doing in a larger risk context. And so very often, we go to the data owner or the operator or the manager or somebody who's in charge of something, but that might not be the subject matter expert. And there's a difference between subject matter expertise and how something operates and its risk implications. And speaking of, almost no one I've met knows what controls actually do. They'll map it to pieces of NIST cybersecurity framework. They'll talk about prevent, detect, mitigate, all of those things. But what is resistance strength is something that's been on my mind a lot. And it's really, it's in the word, we're resisting threat actors, right? And so if we're talking about a kill chain going over to, I think the kill chain is a bit of a red herring. That's just telling us what place in a series of steps a control might have an impact. What it doesn't do is tell us actually if it's really interfering with a bad guy. Bad guys aren't hurricanes, they're not natural disasters, they're thoughtful. They're going to pivot. And so when you're thinking through things like resistance strength and what does a control do, you're really asking, how is it impacting the bad guy's ability to run through their value chain and achieve their objective? This is, the model we're working on right now is this denying surface area over time to the threat actor? Is this denying visibility of the surface area? Is this making surface area difficult? Or is it, once that surface area is exploited, are they going to be stopped for some other reason? It's really, in my mind, starts to become our OODA loop, observe, orient, detect, and act versus their OODA loop, and how are we getting in front of it? And that's not so sequential in a lot of cases. And that's, if we try to outline every single attack pattern, with MITRE attack framework and all of that, it would be really long, and it would miss the forest for the trees, in my opinion. So, when you're thinking about controls, one of the best pieces of advice I can give is think about how's it actually interfering with the bad guy in their operations. Not so much as it's stopping this particular chain of events. Along those lines, infrastructure, you're just the middleman. I've spent some time trying to define what questions we're actually trying to answer when we gather data. And a question came up for us about what do we need in an architecture diagram? And there's two things we need, and it's neither of them is actually about the architecture. The first is a resistance strength susceptibility conversation. The architecture provides a surface area to the bad guys. What is that surface area? And so we're not asking, hey, what systems are there? We're asking what tools exist, what opportunities to exploit existing technical or data stacks exist, et cetera. So your architecture has to at least speak to that. The second question, and I misspoke, there's three. The second question is what control opportunities are provided given a technical stack, given a data stack, given a process stack. And then the third question that an architecture is answering is what expectations are supported, going back to loss, what customer expectations are being supported, what regulatory expectations are being supported by this. And so if you abstract away the technology, when you say, what is the architecture in the scenario? It's what surface area do we have to deal with? What control opportunities do we have? What control implementations do we have? And then, what expectations being supported so that we understand what loss events might be triggered. And it's helpful when you're coming up with your scenarios, coming up with your data, to really dive into what questions you're trying to answer with that information. And it's not necessarily a fair factor. So how are we doing for time?
Right on schedule, Jack. Yeah, well, how about if you could wrap in 5 minutes, and then we'll take some questions or interact with our panel here to
Sure.
Explore some of your points.
So 2 more things, and I think these are related. One is meet them where they're at, and then red, yellow, and green are okay. Most people aren't thinking about this the way we are, and even the ones that are operating in maybe a different space than we are. So everything, the idea of standing up a risk analyses where, again, we pop up an ALE and we pop up an analysis, isn't actually always helpful, even if someone comprehends what that analysis says. A lot of my interest is right now is in, what are the existing decision tools that people are using, and how can I support those decision tools without taking people out of their roles, without taking people out of their process? Maybe they never see an ALE. If I'm helping to prioritize risk assessment or compliance assessments based on risk, then giving them an ALE is unhelpful. But I can give them something that is driven by an ALE that will help them prioritize those assessments. But to ask everyone to translate my view into their view is maybe not going to work at scale. And so to that end, there's a lot of, it's easy to make fun of like yellow, red, and green signaling in risk, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Our job, if we take quantification out of it and how much we like FAIR, is to inform people in a way that's going to have them react appropriately in terms of timing, urgency, degree to the risk that they face. And so in that case, if red, yellow, and green do it, and that's supported by data, fabulous. One of my favorite examples is years ago, we had an executive at a managed security services provider who just knew nothing about security, but she's kind of a micromanager, and she wanted a red, yellow, green risk dashboard, and we thought really hard about it, and we talked, and eventually we gave her a really pretty dashboard that had a yellow JPEG on it, and it never changed. Because risk was never green, and if it was red and urgent, somebody would tell her, and yellow just gave her the impression that everything was being handled, but there was something going on. And that signaling worked perfectly. It wasn't her role, and she reacted appropriately, and we were able to leverage. So, that's a little bit of an extreme example, but we're working in semaphores. ALE, if ALE signals something and it gets the right answer, then use ALE. If frequency is signaling the right thing and it gets the right response, use frequency. And so when you're exploring what part of the, people ask me sometimes, well, should we use average ALE or should we use 90% confidence? Part of that, it takes a village, and part of that, meet them where at, is what is going to give them the best information to make their decision, not what is necessarily the most complete picture. You need to create that link between the output and the decision that's being made. So I think I've covered just about all of these at this point, if not more. So
no, that's awesome. I love your approach. I love just looking at the little sticky notes here. Hey, we got 10 minutes for Q&A with Jack. So feel free to either go off mic or put it in the chat. I'll just kick us off, Jack, on your first point. All journeys have a destination, and that the various ways a risk quantification program gets off the ground at organizations is varied. So if you could speak to the group of people like we have here, we got 50 people here, and they may have taken that step to say, yeah, the value proposition cybersecurity is to affect risk, and they're fighting the maturity or compliance approach, and they are the catalyst for FAIR in their organization. And so it's the organic bottom up evangelistic approach. So I'm not sure if you've lived through that before, but that's I hear that a lot. But that journey would have multiple destinations. But any advice you give to somebody that's trying to affect change from maybe a manager, but an individual contributor standpoint?
Yeah, I would. It's a two-part answer, and it's not a complicated answer. The first is pick something that somebody's making a decision on in the near term. I'm working on two paths right now, and FAIR is new to Datto. I think they kicked off a couple months before I got there, so late 2020. So I'm speaking from a very new program perspective as well at the moment. And one of those is, is there a particular decision that's being made that is everyone that the problem is well describable. I'll say, for example, the first one we did at Bank of America that I can remember being a part of was standalone facts. There is a perception in front of committee, and it was a big deal. There was a bunch of people that could not agree on whether or not it was worth removing all of the standalone faxes that didn't have network connectivity controls because they weren't connected to the network. And it was a very discrete, easily modelable problem that sort of mapped directly to FAIR. It was very easy to communicate the different risk factors involved. And it was a problem that people are solving immediately. This has a twofold benefit. One, you're getting something tangible, you're actually doing something tactical. I wouldn't reach for the moon. And the other thing that's super important, and this just came up for me this week, is unless you see an actual analysis, and not just the results, I mean the whole process, like your analysis results should have your process. Here's how we set something up. Here's what data requirements we had. Here's what the data is. Here's what the data means. Here's how it fit into FAIR. And then here are the results. That story should be in the analysis results because it helps make some of these concepts real. It helps make uncertainty as an idea real, helps make ranges real. So you want to dual purpose your initial work. One, it's got to be something that helps somebody, and two, pick something that clearly takes advantage of the tools that you have so that it's easier to explain. Right now, I'm working on two things at once. One is a budget support set of tools, but that's not going to be finished for a while. So in the short term, we're answering, do you have any particular tactical questions that are coming out next quarter? And so we're going to deliver those while at the same time we're building a process and an approach that's going to support decision making for budget generally. But we need that tangible stuff.
Great advice. Great advice. Appreciate that answer. It speaks to sometimes you may get only one. You might only get your one shot if you don't do it well. But when you got a shot, take a thorough approach. I like that. Any other questions? Anybody have?
Yeah, Jack, the apps. The point about the being at the center of the universe. That's an interesting point. And I'm not sure if this is a comment or question or observation or what. But if risk is just one factor in decision making. It's not the factor. It's not even the most important factor. It is just the factor, a factor, I should say, in decision making. Agendas, politics. There's a lot of other things that go into decision making, and individually and organizationally. And I may be taking that point too literally. What are your thoughts?
Sure. So even politics has, and we're seeing this without making a political comment, we're seeing this writ large in the country at the moment. Everybody needs a common reference point. It helps everybody. So even if you're making a political decision, being able to provide that common reference point of what are we making a political decision about is important, and it's going to help improve the quality of those discussions if you move FAIR into the center of things, because, and this is where again it takes a village. You want people to participate. So if you have a process that people have been engaged in, you have common assumptions that are managed, it reduces the space in which politics can play a role. It reduces the space in which some of these other non-risk-based decision factors can play a role, or it enables them to be more effective, and because politics is a thing, it's a part of human decision making. So it may help make them less hostile. So your goal with FAIR, when we're talking about being the center of the universe, is to bring as much data as possible to bear, to apply it as rigorously as possible, so that, just like we said with estimation, somebody's got to estimate at the end of the day. Risk decisions are subjective at the end of the day. So you want to minimize the space of that subjectivity as much as possible. And then that last mile, whether it's due to politics or it's due to some other factor, whether it's somebody's mood, you minimize the space in which that exists to operate.
Yeah, I guess it also assumes that there's a rational decision maker involved. Right. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but maybe not. No, it's really not, because humans, we are in it's been proven that we are not always rational decision makers.
And this is where meet them where they're at is important. If they're making a decision on a certain set of bases, you should spend some time understanding what those bases are and make sure that analysis speaks as much to that as possible. It might not be rational, but this is why red, yellow, again, going back to our executive who we just gave her a yellow JPEG on a pretty interface, right? You're managing, you can manage up with FAIR to some extent by understanding their key decision basis. I think we called it, there's decision by attrition, right? The last person standing is a decision model that people make. They yell until everyone gives up. But if you can give them something specific to yell about, then you're short-circuiting that a little bit.